Right now, someone somewhere is probably using heroin. And if you think that makes heroin an ancient drug, something humans have been taking for thousands of years, here's the strange part. It isn't. Heroin is actually surprisingly modern. It didn't exist when the pyramids were being built. It didn't exist when the Romans ruled the Mediterranean. It didn't exist when the first cities appeared. In fact, heroin didn't even exist when people first discovered opium. Its story starts much earlier, thousands of years earlier. And to understand how humans eventually created heroin, we have to go back to a small purple flower, the opium poppy. About 5,000 years ago, somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia, humans were already cultivating this plant. The Sumerians called it something that roughly translated to the plant of joy. And they weren't smoking heroin. They didn't even know what heroin was. They were collecting the milky sap that came from the poppy. That sap dried into opium, and opium turned out to be one of the most powerful substances the ancient world had ever discovered. It could reduce pain. It could make people sleepy. It could calm the body. And unfortunately, it could also create dependence. The strange thing is that humans didn't need a laboratory to discover it. The plant was already making the drug for them. By the time ancient civilizations were writing things down, opium had already become part of medicine, religion, and trade. Egyptians used opium preparations. Greek physicians wrote about its effects. Roman doctors used opium as a painkiller. For thousands of years, humans had essentially been experimenting with the same plant, but nobody had created heroin yet, because heroin requires something much more complicated: chemistry. Fast forward thousands of years. It's the 1800s. Chemists are beginning to understand that plants don't just contain mysterious substances. They contain specific chemical compounds, and if you isolate those compounds, you can change them. In 1804, German pharmacist Friedrich Sautern isolated morphine from opium, and this was a huge moment. For the first time, humans had separated one of the main active chemicals in opium from the plant itself. Morphine was incredibly powerful. Doctors could use it to control severe pain, but there was a problem. People could become dependent on it. And during the 19th century, morphine became increasingly common in medicine. It was used for injuries. It was used after surgery. It was used for chronic pain. It was even widely used during wars. Then came 1894. A German pharmaceutical company called Bayer began experimenting with new medicines. One of its chemists, Felix Hoffmann, was involved in producing diacetylmorphine in a form suitable for pharmaceutical use, and Bayer gave the substance a name: heroin. Why? Because the drug was believed to produce a powerful, heroic feeling. And then something extraordinary happened. Heroin was marketed as medicine. Not as an illegal street drug, not as something hidden in dark alleys, as medicine. It was sold in pharmacies, it was advertised to doctors, and Bayer promoted it as a treatment for problems including coughs and respiratory illnesses. There was even a bizarre belief that heroin could help people who were dependent on morphine. Think about that. A substance derived from morphine was being presented as a potential solution to morphine dependence. And for a while, people didn't fully understand how dangerous it could be. That's because the modern concept of addiction was still developing. Doctors understood that some drugs could create dependence, but they didn't yet understand the full biological mechanisms behind addiction the way we do today. So heroin entered medicine at exactly the wrong moment. Chemistry had become powerful. Pharmaceutical manufacturing had become industrial. But scientific understanding of addiction was still catching up. And then reality became impossible to ignore. People were becoming dependent on heroin. The drug could produce intense euphoria, and rapidly lead to compulsive use. And unlike many traditional medicines, it could create a cycle where the person kept taking it not simply because they wanted its effects, but because stopping could become extremely difficult. By the early 20th century, governments began restricting opioids. The United States passed the Heroin Narcotics Tax Act in 1914. Other countries introduced their own restrictions. Heroin gradually disappeared from legitimate medical use in many places. But the story didn't end. It changed. Instead of being sold openly in pharmacies, heroin increasingly moved into illegal markets, and that transformation created the heroin trade we recognize today. So here's the strange timeline. About 5,000 years ago, humans were cultivating opium poppies. Thousands of years later, humans isolated morphine. In 1874, a chemist created heroin. In 1898, Bayer commercialized it as a medicine. And within only a few decades, the drug that had once been sold by legitimate pharmaceutical companies became one of the world's most notorious illicit drugs. That's the part of the story that sounds almost impossible. Heroin isn't an ancient drug. The ancient drug was opium. Heroin is the product of modern chemistry. Humans spent thousands of years discovering what the poppy could do. Then, in less than a century, chemistry allowed us to change a molecule that nature had already given us. And sometimes the most dangerous discoveries aren't the ones we find in nature. They're the ones we learn how to improve.